going to start a bit unconventionally by asking the audience a couple of questions. Partly what I'd like to say, I hope you know how privileged you are to have been here today. I think it's a really quite astonishing event, and I want to congratulate Griffith University for what they've been able to put together. You know, my first question is, and it has to be a show of hands, how many of you are students? Show of hands. Good. Hands down. Second question, how many of you, and I've thought carefully about what word I'd use, are concerned about the asylum seeker issue in Australia? Virtually everyone. Good. I mean, for me. If the words you may have read is how I begin my talk. If you'd been told 30 years ago that Australia would create the least asylum seeker friendly institutional arrangements in the world, you would not have been believed. In 1992, we introduced a system of indefinite mandatory detention for asylum seekers who arrived by boat. Since that time, we have accepted the idea that certain categories of refugees and asylum seekers can be imprisoned indefinitely, that those who are intercepted by our Navy should be forcibly returned to the point of departure, that those who haven't been able to be forcibly returned should be imprisoned indefinitely on remote Pacific islands, and that those marooned on these island camps should never be allowed to settle in Australia, even after several years. How, then, has this come to pass? Now, in my view, there are two main ways of explaining it. The first is what can be called analytical narrative, really history, the creation of an historical account which shows the circumstances in which the decisions were made and how one thing led to another. I have tried my hand at several of these. The second way is to look at more general lines of explanation. I want to suggest 5 possibilities. These general lines of explanation are not alternatives to the historical account, but complementary to it. Rather, what I'm trying to do is illuminate some of the general reasons the story the historians might tell took the shape it did. And I'm going to announce each category so you can think about them one by one. What I'm doing here is distilling really what's been on my mind for a very long time, distilling into 20 minutes. First is what I call immigration absolutism. It is very common to explain the creation of Australia's uniquely harsh asylum seeker system as a partially disguised return of the old racism of the White Australia policy. This now, I didn't always believe this, but this now seems to me mistaken. Even though there have been occasional political hiccups, the Blaney affair in 1984, John Howard's intervention, 1988, the rise of Hanson, what I call Hanson 1, in 1996, the re-rise in 2016. Despite these hiccups, one of the more remarkable achievements of Australian history is the seamless transformation of white Australia to a multiracial and multicultural society since the early 1970s. Nor is there evidence that Australians are hostile to non-European refugees selected by the government. As I observed as a refugee advocate in the late 1970s, it was easier for the Fraser government to settle 70,000 Indochinese refugees from the camps of Southeast Asia that the government had itself selected than it was to allay public fear or anger over only 2,000 Vietnamese who arrived in Darwin spontaneously by boat. There is, however, another aspect of the White Australia policy, which is usually overlooked. It's absolutism, the almost 100-year conviction that not one single person of non-European stock should ever be permitted to settle in Australia. In my view, it has been the absolutism embedded in what's been called the Australian immigration culture of control, rather than the racism of the White Australia policy, which helps explain our recent history, now animated by a new absolutist ambition, which I don't believe any other country shares, that we should strive for a situation where not even one asylum seeker boat reaches our shores. Section 2, what I call party politics or Howard's curse. For those of you very young, the Howard I have in mind is John. It is obvious that the Tampa crisis, in inverted commas, of August-September 2001 was the most important moment in the creation of Australia's contemporary asylum seeker policies. There is no need to rehearse what happened once again, or I could, but it would take too long. For obvious reasons, the creation of the offshore processing centres, and even more importantly, the use of the Navy to turn back asylum seeker boats to Indonesia was crucial for the future of the policy. What, however, is less often discussed is the way in which the Prime Minister, John Howard, spurned the bipartisanship over asylum seeker policy offered him by Kim Beazley, and the long-term consequences of his short-term political opportunism. During Tampa, Beazley supported every radical measure taken by the government. Memorably, he said, "This was no time," I quote him, "for carping." The only bridge too far for Beazley was a bill which denied that it would be a criminal offence for a border control official to take the life of an asylum seeker by manslaughter or murder. Howard seized upon this remark. For the purpose of the 2001 election and in the election campaigns of 2004, 2010, 2013, 2016, the only exception perhaps was 2007, the coalition has profitably been able to accuse Labor of being weak on border protection. It was not only Tony Abbott who based his prime ministerial credentials on the success of his border control policies. In the last election campaign, Malcolm Turnbull used the idea of Labor's weakness on border security as the one populist element in what was essentially a non-populist election pitch. The consequence of all this has been that over the past 15 years, the chance of an even remotely humane reform of the system carries with it the chance of severe electoral punishment for the Labor Party. The only hope now for a return of some humanity to the policy is the willingness of a coalition government to initiate such reform or to offer Labor bipartisanship in trying to work together to find a less cruel and ruinous policy. I call the last 15 years of opportunistic partisan contention over asylum seeker policy Howard's curse. 3. This section is called bureaucratic inertia, and here's a strange word, automaticity, the automatic. The history of anti-asylum seeker border control policy is a history of deterrence measures. The first two that were tried, mandatory detention in Australia and temporary protection visas, failed at least as measured by the absolutist standards of the authorities. The second two measures that were introduced by Howard at the time of Tampa, offshore processing and forcible turnback to point of departure, succeeded. Between 2002 and 2007, virtually no boats reached Australia. What to me is interesting about this history is the force of bureaucratic inertia, the continued expansion of the system in a way that was unrelated to evidence or experience. It was clear by the second half of 2002, after Tampa, that the combination of offshore processing and turnback had successfully stopped the arrival of asylum seeker boats. They just stopped. It was also clear by late 2013 that the combination of offshore processing, naval turnback, and now Kevin Rudd's July 2013 edition, which was No Settlement in Australia Ever, which I call Rudd's Curse, as the addition to Howard's Curse, that these had once again successfully stopped the boats. Boats stopped arriving at the end of 2013. Yet in both cases, this fact had no influence in softening policy with regard to the earlier deterrent measures, mandatory detention and temporary protection, which had by now been rendered entirely redundant. They did no work. The ends had been achieved by other means, yet the earlier means were nonetheless retained. How is this to be explained? Which is now, it's not a minor matter. This cruelty is rendering the lives of more than 30,000 fellow human beings miserable. In his analysis of post-totalitarian Czechoslovakia, a classical book called The Power of the Powerless, Václav Havel outlines in some detail a system that no longer serves any interest, where within the system, both the relationship of different measures to each other and the relationship of means to ends had long been forgotten by everyone. He calls the engine that drives this system automaticity, which is where my term comes from. Despite the fact that no asylum seeker boats now reach Australia, in essence because of the success of the turnback policy, mandatory detention is maintained, refugees are granted temporary visas which offer no hope of citizenship or permanent settlement. Some asylum seekers who cannot be deported are locked away indefinitely. Refugees and asylum seekers who have been sent to offshore processing centres are left to rot there permanently. The force of bureaucratic inertia, the reign of automaticity, helps explain the purposeless cruelty of so much of the current asylum seeker system. 4. Borrows from a classic study in political science, groupthink. There has been only one time in the history of the anti-asylum seeker policy where deterrent measures were dismantled. Kevin Rudd, in 2008, abandoned both offshore processing and turnback, although his government retained mandatory detention. At the time, I thought this partial dismantling a risk. I now think it was, because of what's happened since, a mistake. The consequence of the dismantling was the arrival between 2009 and 2013 of some 50,000 asylum seekers by boat and more than 1,000 drownings. Because of this, because of what happened between 2009 and 2013, a curious mindset emerged. It was already present in the Howard years, but it now came to dominate the key policy makers and the immigration public servants during the period of both the Abbott and now the Turnbull governments. Let me say in a short way this mindset. The mindset suggested that even if one brick of the asylum seeker deterrent system was removed, the entire building would collapse. By now, the Immigration Minister, the Immigration Department, and the relevant defence officials all agreed with each other that large numbers of boats would return if even the slightest change was allowed to be made to the asylum seeker edifice that had been gradually constructed over the past 25 years. Let one example of this strange mindset suffice. Late last year, in my hometown, Melbourne, doctors and nurses at the Royal Children's Hospital announced that they would not return a handful of gravely damaged children under their care to a detention centre in Melbourne. The Minister, Peter Dutton, still the Minister, responded by saying that the result of their irresponsible behaviour would be naval officers pulling the bodies of dead children from the ocean. The Minister apparently sincerely believed that freeing a few children from detention in Melbourne would send an international signal to the people smugglers that would see a return of the boats and the drownings. This was telling evidence of how far by now officials in Canberra have lost touch with reality. Officials now believe that one act of human decency will lead to an armada of asylum seeker boats setting out for Australia. One reason for the purposeless cruelty of the asylum seeker policy is then the severe case of groupthink, the willingness of intelligent people to still their critical capacities in the interest of conformity, the case of groupthink that now afflicts Canberra. 5, final section, what I call the banality of evil. At present, more than 2,000 men, women and children are slowly being destroyed in body and spirit. Some are being destroyed, the majority of these, because they are marooned on Nauru and Manus Island and have been for 3 years or more. A smaller number of refugees have been imprisoned in Australia for several years because of the existence of an adverse ASIO file or because Iran will not accept involuntary repatriation. Among the families of those who were brought from Nauru to Australia for medical treatment and from Manus Island, 300 now live in daily, crippling fear of return. I am certain that the immigration and defence officials, some of who I know, who are responsible for administering the policy, are not sadists. There is thus something further about our willingness to inflict such cruelty that needs to be explained. The most important idea in a book that was once very controversial, Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, is The Banality of Evil, the subtitle of the book. The idea is usually misunderstood. In essence, what Arendt tried to explain was how evil acts might be perpetrated by conventional individuals because of their blindness, their loss of the capacity to see what it was that they were doing. See went deep, to see. Arendt's idea helped explain how the atmosphere created within Nazi Germany allowed the most extreme of all state-sponsored acts of political evil to appear to a conventional bureaucratic character like Eichmann to be normal. The extreme context from which this idea emerged does not mean, however, that the concept of the banality of evil cannot illuminate far smaller matters. A detailed moral history of Australia's asylum seeker policy since the introduction of mandatory detention in 1992 has not yet been written. I hope one day it is. What it would reveal is the process whereby the arteries of the nation gradually hardened. How, as a nation, we gradually lost the capacity to see the horror of what it was that we were willing to do to innocent fellow human beings who have fled in fear and who have sought our help. Recently, an inmate on Nauru set himself on fire and shortly after died. Peter Dutton argued in response that people self-immolate so they can get to Australia. It took 30 years of brutal behaviour for a remark like this to be possible, and for Australians in general not to notice how truly remarkable was the minister's brutality. So let me conclude. Our current uniquely harsh asylum seeker policy is grounded in the absolutist ambitions that, in my view, can best be explained by Australia's long-term migration history and its associated culture of control. It has become entrenched because of the force of bureaucratic inertia that has seen the system grow automatically, while any interest in or understanding of the relation of means to ends has been lost. And it is presently maintained by an irrational but consensual mindset that has Canberra in its grip. The conviction that even one concession to human kindness will send a message to the people smugglers and bring the whole system crashing down. Because of these factors, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Immigration, the senior officials of Immigration and Defence are presently allowing the lives of some 2,000 human beings to be destroyed on the basis of faulty but unquestioned speculation, and the lives of another 30,000 in Australia to be rendered acutely insecure and anxious for no purpose. They are willing to allow this to happen because they no longer possess, in the Arendtian sense, the ability to see what it is that they are doing, and because, alas, the majority of the nation has become accustomed to thinking of what we are doing as perfectly normal. Thank you.